the story of Charlie Parker.
Parker's playing it, then it's a wonderful instrument. Outside of that, you know, it's just another saxophone.
The blues was really one of the things that separated Dizzy Gillespie from Charlie Parker, because Bird was always blues-based, and no matter what he played, somewhere along the line, there was some reference to the fact that he really grew up with the Kansas City kind of thing and that Midwestern idea of swinging.
Dr. Billy Taylor, pianist, composer, contemporary of Charlie Parker, and the foremost jazz educator anywhere over recent decades. Parker was a unique innovator, one of the most influential players in all of modern music, and he died before his 35th birthday. He didn't come out of nowhere. He had to emerge from the swing era because he was born in 1920, so in his teenage years, swing was what there was. That Midwestern notion of swing Billy Taylor talked about was defined for all time one morning in 1936 in a small recording studio in Chicago, where a little quintet led by Count Basie laid down 4 tracks that lit the pathway to what became modern jazz. The players had been up all night, but tenor saxist Lester Young in particular still sounded boundingly fresh on Lady Be Good.
What he did, what Lester Young did was so personal. I mean, that it just fit those kind of things, and at that time, and what he did with melodies led into, I believe, many of the things that Charlie Parker later did, because he would play over. He would play. He wouldn't play all the notes in a chord. He wouldn't. He wouldn't do that. I mean, he might play. He was playing intervals of some kind of way, and that was melodic to his ear. And I think Bird liked that. I hear that in some phases of what he did. So by the time bebop came along, people would say, well, you know, harmonically, we've got all these notes to play with and all these rhythms to add to the music. This is what we want to do.
The teenage Charlie Parker was a wild child on the loose in Kansas City, with an absentee father and a mother who would have been overprotective if she'd been able to keep track of Charlie's movements. But music practice took its place among a range of prematurely adult activities. He was married at 15 and a heroin addict somewhere around the same time, encouraged perhaps not just by local pushers, but also by a serious car accident in which Charlie suffered several broken bones, including some sort of spinal fracture. The attractions of morphine were medicinal at first, it's said, and then recreational, if that's the word for an attachment to drugs that was destined to help bring his life to an early end. In music also, Parker got way ahead of himself, as he later admitted.
I learned the scale, and I learned how to play 2 tunes in a certain key, in the key of D, with your saxophone F concert. Yeah. I learned how to play the first 8 bars of Lazy River, and I knew the complete tune of Honeysuckle Rose. I didn't ever stop to think about there was none of keys or nothing like that. So I took my horn out to this joint where guys, a bunch of fellas who I had seen around were, and the first thing they started playing was Body and Soul, long beat, you know, like this. So I go to playing my Honeysuckle Rose, and there ain't no form of commemoration, you know, so they laughed me off the bandstand. That got me so hard.
How old were you then?
That was long around the same time, 16, 17.
There were some humiliating setbacks, the notorious one, if it's completely true, being the jam session when young Parker was gonged off stage, more or less literally, by Count Basie's drummer, Joe Jones, whom we just heard on Lady Be Good. Just as Parker was getting into a solo, Jones detached a large cymbal and frisbeed it across the stage towards him, and it landed with a great crash that reportedly robbed Charlie of the will to play for weeks, if not months. But he recovered his morale, and before too long was playing in one of the new local groups aspiring to replace Count Basie, whose band had departed to New York. Jay McShann was the band leader, and a few years ago at a Parker symposium in Kansas City, I asked him about that. Some people would say to start a big band, especially in those days, was, you know, you're asking for a lot of trouble. Was it a big decision for you?
It was a big decision. Well, it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, because, you see, I had a small group at that time. They wanted about a 14, 15-piece group, see? And that was the decision for me, you know, making up my mind to throw away the small group, which I never should have done, and grab the big group, you know. So I grabbed the big group, but I was lucky enough to come out of it.
McShann had the reputation of being an enthusiastic carouser, but he was also highly organized in his preparation of the band. On its early trial gigs, he would leave the rhythm section playing on stage while he rehearsed the brass in an upstairs room.
And after the first 2 hours, I'd bring them down and put the brass section on the bandstand with the rhythm section and send the reeds upstairs to rehearse. And then after about 2 or 3 weeks, then I brought it down and put it together, and the guy heard all that brass screaming and, you know, the reeds moaning. And they say, we like that, we like that. I said, well, just don't stop me from rehearsing like I've been doing. I said, the rhythm section will take care of everything out here. Just let me continue to do it. He says, okay. So that's how I got the big band together. Yeah. So we were ready for the road when we finished that gig, see.
Charlie Parker played briefly with McShann at this stage and with another local leader called Harlan Leonard, but he wasn't yet ready to apply himself to the regular attendance required of members of a large group. He never really was. Besides, and this is a part of his story that can never quite be explained, Charlie Parker, even before his saxophone technique was fully in order, felt in his head that there were other, more ambitious ways of playing this music. So he set off to New York by himself to see if he could find in the flesh what he was almost hearing in imagination. He travelled in traditional bluesman style by hopping a freight train. Jazz in New York was reaching a pitch of technical expertise where the fluency of the players was beginning to expose the limitations of the basic material. When John Kirby's band recorded Rehearsing for a Nervous Breakdown in 1938, the title might have been a prediction of the way things were going, though there were a few players around whose virtuosity seemed always in step with their creative imagination. The Art Tatum of the late 30s, and it's reported that Charlie Parker washed dishes in a club where Tatum played in hopes of enough time off to hear what the great man was doing. But Tatum, of course, was available to be heard elsewhere, and he wasn't alone, as Billy Taylor points out, in seeking to expand the borders of music making.
I remember back in the 30s, one of the most popular songs. No, that's in the 30s. So yeah, and it starts off with a major seventh. You know, Clarence Prophet was a man who used to jam with Tatum, and they would do some of the most unusual things that I ever heard. They would take a song like Body and Soul and improvise on the harmony. They'd play the melody. And so instead of playing... Now, they would, you know... Now, all he's doing is chromatic. You know, in those days, you know, no one was thinking, most people were not thinking along those lines. And people were thinking if it's harmony, go, no. It's something relatively simple.
There were other elements, too, that seem now to have been pointing forward to the music Parker eventually made. One was the trend for novelty riff tunes with surprising, displaced rhythmic accents. Even Fats Waller and his rhythm occasionally went in for those. That tune, Scram, happened to be written by the jazz critic Leonard Feather, who certainly knew which way the winds of musical fashion were blowing in those days. All those elements and more were available to be worked on in New York, but the chord extensions are certainly the most important factor. Parker found an ally for his researches in a guitarist called William Biddy Fleet, with whom he played both experimentally after hours and, as a surviving poster shows, in formal club engagements. Fleet was a man who seems never to have recorded, except, curiously, at a ramshackle 1938 session in Baltimore with the New Orleans piano pioneer Jelly Roll Morton, a most curious link between the origins of jazz and its newest explorer. Jelly Roll Morton hadn't too much time for other pianists' tunes, but there, curiously enough, with Biddy Fleet, he was playing Fats Waller's Honeysuckle Rose, one of the favourite jamming tunes for Kansas City players. In fact, when we hear Charlie Parker immortalised for the very first time in an amateur recording from 1940, he's playing that same tune, entirely unaccompanied. By then, he was back in Kansas City, sounding perhaps more advanced in manner than in harmonic complexity. That peeling quality his phrases had was something he'd picked up from a local sax master called Buster Smith. Charlie's progress must have been attracting attention because, on rejoining the Jay McShann Band, he found that his style was being copied, as the leader couldn't help noticing.
Well, you see, there was a little young cat named John Jackson. J.J. was sitting back there listening to Bird. Bird had no idea J.J. had been picking up on him. J.J. could outread Bird at the time, too, you know. So one night, Bird was late getting to the stand, so I told J.J., take the solo, take the solo. And Bird was way back in the back of the room. Bird, J.J. blowing that solo. Bird flew up there to the bandstand. He says, man, don't ever give this cat none of my solos, no more solos. Don't give him no more of my solos. No. I said, what's the matter? He said, no, I don't want him blowing none of my solos. I want to keep all of my solos. Okay. But that is the only time I ever seen Bird really get, he had, quiet as it's kept, he always had pretty good control of himself. And that was one of the few times I've seen him kind of, lose it a little bit,
The nickname Bird, by the way, seems certain to have arisen from the fuller version Yardbird, but whether that arose from Parker's eating a lot of chicken, Yardbird was a down-home name for that, or whether it was because he hung around the backyards of Kansas City clubs when he was too young to go in, or for any other reason, will never definitely be known. Back to New York he went with the McShann Band, which thrived there. The habit of experimental jamming at venues better known to musicians than the public had really caught on, and Clark Monroe's Uptown House, and even more Minton's Playhouse, were now the places to try out your newest ideas. The short-lived guitarist Charlie Christian was recorded there, showing how much the emerging music owed to guitarists, particularly in the matter of length of phrase. Guitar players didn't have to pause for breath. Swing to Bop, a title applied later to indicate what seemed to be happening in that performance at Minton's.
Minton's gets most of the credit because that was the most visible place, but those kind of sessions were happening all over New York in those days. There were plenty of places to play, and guys got together in people's houses and all kinds of things in addition to going to Minton's. Minton's was a place where you could play as long and as loud as you wanted to, so that made it very special.
Dr. Billy Taylor. Playing as long as wind and inspiration lasted was a great luxury. On records, in a biggish band, you were lucky to get one full chorus or half of one. But Charlie Parker stayed with Jay McShann long enough to make records giving surer indications of what was to come. On The Jumpin' Blues in 1942, for example, he started his solo with a pet phrase that was later built into the famous bebop anthem called Ornithology.
Lonely, nothing seems okay. When you're feeling lonely, nothing seems okay. Forget your troubles and jump your blues away.
The vocal by Walter Brown at the time was the selling point of the record, but it's treasured now for that proto-Parker solo. Soon after that came an important phase in Charlie's development that remains largely untraceable in sound because of the Musicians' Union recording ban that kept the bands out of the studios from August 1942 until, in some cases, late 44. So we missed the moment at the end of 42 when Charlie Parker joins the big band of the veteran pianist Earl Hines, where Dizzy Gillespie is already featured in the trumpet section. Hines himself once recalled how much those two practiced together.
Charlie was the type fellow that he knew his instrument, and he never ventured out to do something he couldn't do. And he and Dizzy Gillespie used to take the exercise book and go in the dressing room between shows and play the exercises. And later they inserted these things that they learned from the exercise book into tunes, and as we would play them.
Parker played tenor sax in Hines's band because that's what was needed, and there is a private hotel room recording from early 1943 made by an enthusiast called Bob Redcross, where you and I and Lawrence Schoenberg can hear how he sounded.
The Red Cross recordings, with Dizzy and Oscar Pettiford and those different things, those are really interesting because on the tenor, he's just another good tenor player. Kind of. I mean, if you were to listen to that recording of Sweet Georgia Brown with Pettiford and Gillespie, on the one hand, yeah, I mean, if you listen real carefully, of course, you'll say, yes, he's playing phrases that other people weren't phrasing and were playing quite that way. But it wouldn't stop you in your tracks, and that's always amazed me.
Parker playing Sweet Georgia Brown with impressive command there in room 305 of the Savoy Hotel in Chicago, encouraged by shouts from Dizzy Gillespie addressed to Yard, the alternative shortening of Yardbird. But that human cry, childlike cry perhaps, that his alto sax tone launched upon the air, was muffled by the tenor sax, and he used the tenor rarely after that time. Now the singer Billy Eckstine left Earl Hines and formed his own band of out-and-out experimenters, including both Gillespie and Parker, but that too didn't record till Parker had left. In fact, for many music followers, he remained a creature of myth, at least until 1944, when a group of recordings by the Tiny Grimes Quintet came out. These were not the most advanced players of the time, but Tiny Grimes himself was Art Tatum's guitarist, so he was certainly not afraid of daring music, and Parker was able to show that there was a new edge, several new edges, to his playing. Part of Tiny's tempo, at last bringing Charlie Parker's style to the microphone in close-up, as it were. That was a sound and an articulation like no other at the time, so Parker's search was clearly paying off, but gigging on 52nd Street in New York, he was leading a fast life, as ever. In January 1945, he and Gillespie played a session on which a veteran vaudevillian called Rubber Legs Williams sang some blues, but not quite in the style he'd intended. In conversation with Leonard Feather, Parker explained that the innards of a Benzedrine inhaler were responsible.
We sent out for coffee and sandwiches, so I took the thing out of one of these inhaler tubes and put it in my coffee, and the coffee got confused. Oh, help me God, it really did, man. And Rubber drank it.
Oh, my
And we say like, how you have an intermission or something, on a recording day. About 20 minutes later, he hit Rubber and he made that record.
Oh, he must have been out of his mind.
He was.
Oh, it sounds like it on the record. He sounds really
that's what
crazy.
went down.
Oh,
Everybody laughs about it. That's Teddy Regal.
See, that's funny.
Oh, when you know them guys are going, used to own that company.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's a crazy record.
Isn't it? You remember, did you ever wake up in the morning?
That's it,
And
yeah.
he just shouts.
Yeah, it just sounds really...
When I was in California, whoever would wake up, they'd open all the doors and play that record.
Oh, it's not to scare anybody.
That was Charlie's third wife, Doris, in the background. The interest in the story is not that Rubber Legs Williams' name suddenly came true as his vocals disintegrated into roaring incoherence, but that Parker took the Benzedrine so much for granted. He was already inured to such comparatively mild stimulants, and surely would have shown no audible effect himself if he had drunk the contaminated coffee. Next time we'll see how musical genius and narcotic fixation continued to grow in parallel. I'm Russell Davis, and this was an Associated Rediffusion production for BBC Radio 2. The producer was Graham Pass.
I used to love your mama, but it's all over now. I've come to the conclusion you never loved me. No, I'm going away, baby. I'm going away, baby.